Since we know from Revelation chapter number 11, verse 1 and 2, that the Temple Mount in the final 3.5 years, we know that for sure. I would remind you, it says it very clearly. Since we know that, then the question is, how do we get from where we are to that prophetic fulfillment? It's going to happen. We just don't know how. Now, we mentioned to you before our last break that a Hebrew professor, Asher Kaufman, has promoted this concept for years. His work was published in the Biblical Archaeological Review and in other publications, espousing that the temple never was at the location of the Dome of the Rock. He contended that it really was north of the Dome of the Rock. Now, if you've ever been to the Temple Mount, on the north side of the Dome of the Rock, there's a little cupola which is called the Dome of the Spirits. Some people think that this was in fact the site of the holiest of holies. Kaufman says that that was the holiest of holies, that the temple should be built north of the Dome of the Rock. He says there's room there, and he gave us a diagram. Now, in this diagram which he gave to us, it actually shows that if the temple were built north of the Dome of the Rock, it would leave the Dome of the Rock in the outer court. He says that's not a problem because the Gentiles were allowed in the outer court of the temple area. Now remember what the scripture says. Measure the temple, do not measure the outer court, because it will be trodden down the Gentiles for 42 months. Here we are 2,000 years away from the writing of that vision by John, and yet we have a man in Israel saying this is the way we can solve this problem. We have a president in the United States, President Clinton, now out of office, of course, but his solution at Camp David was, let's forge a sharing arrangement. It appears that that is what is getting ready to happen in the very near future, that actually Israel is going to build their temple, but they're going to say, we're going to be reasonable about this. You tried to drive us out totally. You wouldn't let us be here at all. When we captured the Temple Mount in 1967, we voluntarily brought you back. We could have torn down the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We could have built our temple then. We respected your holy places. You don't respect ours. Now, this argument is going to be quite powerful before the world community, and apparently it's going to carry the day, because Israel is going to build her temple apparently north of the Dome of the Rock, respecting the Muslim holy places, and yet put up this sharing arrangement. Now, Eddie, there's a big problem, however. How in the world are Muslims and Jews going to worship side by side without blowing each other up? They haven't been able to do it up to now.
I think that's one of the reasons that we know it's going to be temporary. I mean, it's going to be a temporary arrangement when the Jewish people complete their temple and begin the sacrifices, and something is going to be made to stop those sacrifices. That's where we see the temporary arrangement.
You know, at Camp David, when they were discussing just this issue, how could we coexist on the Temple Mount? Barak was the one that came up with the idea, well, let's have the UN be a peacekeeping force. Let's not have any policemen of the Muslims or the Arab side. Let's not have any Jewish policemen there. Let's bring the United Nations in there. Now, this was an ominous suggestion from the Prime Minister of Israel. He is actually suggesting bringing the world community in. Remember that the international leader of the world, the Antichrist, will not be known in Israel as the Antichrist. He's going to be a very wonderful politician, and they're actually going to be working together with him. So they're going to suggest, bring the UN, oversee this. This is the arrangement whereby we can live together. Now, this explains perfectly then how the abomination of desolation could happen as described in Daniel chapter 9, verse number 27. It shows us that the leaders of our world, Bill Clinton, Ehud Barak, Shimon Peres, and probably Ariel Sharon, are thinking in these terms. Would the United Nations accept such an arrangement? It appears that they are going to accept it, at least for a while. The temple will be built. When the temple's built, sacrifices will be resumed. What do you think the world's going to think when they start offering little goats and lambs every morning, every evening on the Temple Mount? Where are the animal rights activists going to be in all this?
Horrible. This is barbarism. We cannot allow this.
Israel right now is looking for a red heifer, because they believe they have to have the ashes of a red heifer to purify themselves so that they can go up to the Temple Mount. They thought they had one a couple of years ago, and she developed some white hairs. Her name was Melody, by the way. We went up to see her on one of our trips to Israel, and she developed some white hair in her tails. And
I know the feeling. I understand the exact feeling of developing white hairs. You haven't experienced that yet.
Yes, and I'm also not a red heifer, by the way. But we went up to see this red heifer, and there were white hairs starting to develop in her tail. And the rabbis of Israel, the chief rabbis, came up and actually looked, and they disqualified. They said, this calf is not kosher. But apparently they will come up with a red heifer. Now, there are red heifers that qualify in the United States. There are people who feel like they should help Israel. And Rabbi Chaim Richman, who's the executive director of the Temple Institute in Jerusalem, actually flew to the United States and looked at some of the red heifers here. But I'm just saying all this so that you will understand that there are very active movements in America that are promoting some of these very concepts that are in the prophecies of the Bible. But when the animal sacrifices are finally resumed after the temple is built, I'm sure the animal rights activists, I can see the news now on the front page of the New York Times. I can see the people with their little banners, animals have rights to barbarism in the 20th century. I can see CNN there at the dedication of the temple when they hone in as the chief rabbi raises his knife and plunges it into the jugular vein of the animal sacrifice for the dedication of the third temple. When the lens zooms in on that and the blood begins to gurgle out, I mean, it's going to go like wildfire around the world. By 6 o'clock the next morning, there's going to be pickets on every synagogue in the world, because people are going to be saying, this is barbarism. We cannot deal with this. Now, it's at that point the Antichrist is going to be an environmentalist. I'm sure he will be. He's going to be rising to power. And it's at that point that his fax machine is going to be working nonstop, and they're going to be melting the lines into his headquarters saying, we helped you to power. We cannot tolerate this. And I'm sure he's going to say something like, look, relax. There'll be a press conference on the White House steps, or on the temple steps tomorrow at 12 noon. Be there. And all the cameras will be there. CNN, Reuters, NBC, CBS, they will all be there. And the Antichrist will probably say something like this. And we're talking about the abomination of desolation here, Eddie. He's probably going to stand up with all the cameras there and say, look, we've got a problem. We know that these animal sacrifices have been very unpopular. They were temporarily necessary. This is what the Jewish Bible tells them they should do. However, we've come up with a solution. You see, it's been rumored for some time that perhaps I could be your Messiah. I helped build your temple. I've brought a level of peace and security to Israel. And the articles have been appearing in the different publications speculating as to the possibility that I'm your Messiah. Since you've always believed that the one who builds your temple will be your Messiah, I've said nothing about it to now, but I feel like the present crisis merits me telling you it's true. I am your Messiah. You won't need these sacrifices anymore. Now, what does Daniel 9:27 say? He will confirm the covenant with many for 7 years, but in the midst of the 7 years, he'll cause the sacrifice and the oblation to stop. And for the overspreading of abominations, he makes it desolate.